Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to the end of Act 4 in Richard III. All of that stuff I said in the last video, forget it. We're ruining it all now. Yay! Oh, I don't want to talk about these scenes. Scenes 4 and 5 of Act 5. Act 4. Act 5 will be the next two videos. No, Scene 4 and Scene 5 of Act 4 are not really fun scenes. There are some very awkward conversations that we're going to have to address. Yay. As always, let's start with a brief summary of what happens in these scenes, and then talk about them. Yay. Okay, so Act 4, Scene 4, we start with Margaret, who's real happy she's outlived most of her enemies who have died terribly, including some little boys. Yep, that's how this scene is gonna go. Enter the Queen and the Duchess of York, weeping over the loss of their sons and grandsons. Enter Margaret, mocking them for it. Yep. So all of that womanly camaraderie we had in the last video has rapidly disappeared. Margaret's happy to curse everybody, including Richard, including the Duchess, including the Queen, including the poor little boys that probably didn't deserve to die. And by the time Margaret's on her way out, the Queen actually stops her to ask her to teach her how to curse properly. Margaret says, "You'll figure it out with experience, you dick," and leaves. Well, Margaret's saying she's been through a lot, and everybody else deserves to suffer with her. Yay! Enter Richard, who both the Duchess of York and the Queen actually waylay so that they can curse him. The Queen does an interesting job of bouncing back and forth between, "I'll be patient," and "screw you," before she finally leaves because she's had enough of the one son she's got left. Richard, however, keeps the Queen around because he wants her to help woo her daughter so that he can marry her. Oh God! Oh God! Oh God! Why? A large chunk of this scene is literally like the Queen and Richard talking about this wooing process. Mostly the Queen actually resisting. She says the best way to seduce Elizabeth is to actually send the hearts of her younger brother to her and the blood of all the family members he's killed. And Richard's like, "Come, woman, that's not how you woo a person. Take this seriously." Boy. And one of the most uncomfortable things about this is by the end of this conversation, Richard seems to have actually won the Queen over. She does seem willing to help him out. In fact, they kiss, maybe passionately, maybe not, depending on which version you actually see, before the Queen exits. I mean, it's the last time we'll see any of these women on screen, so might as well just have her apparently take a 180. But Richard doesn't have time for that. The Queen's on it. He'll be married to his niece in no time. Time to worry about everything else. Too bad Richard can't focus. He's very changeable. He doesn't know who to trust. And he wants to take some of his own people's children as hostages. Excellent. Cool. Great. Well, he does have two armies bearing down on him, and Richmond's army seems to keep getting bigger as he's sailing into England. But Buckingham's good news has been defeated. Sorry you hit that poor messenger there, Richard. Yep, it's one of those types of scenes. Buckingham himself has been captured, and Richmond's had to take a detour due to Buckingham's army. So, Richard is winning? End of Scene 4. Scene 5, in comparison, is extremely short. Scene 4 seemed to go on forever in really uncomfortable ways. So, Scene 5, we get the Earl of Derby whose son has been taken hostage by Richard, but actually does seem to be working for Richmond. The Queen might have backtracked. Elizabeth is now set up to be with Richmond, though she was before this point, and it's a question of when those letters got written, and whether that was before or after Richard, You know what? Yeah, okay, so basically, scene 4 is just a mess of uncomfortable things, and scene 5 says these people don't like Richard anymore, if they ever did. So this is gonna get uncomfortable, because we have to address a few things, and a lot of it does have to do with that conversation from the last video, where we do have this really, I feel, touching scene between these three women connecting in their powerlessness as women, which is then just, there are like so many movies, plays, books where positive female relationships are not a thing, because all of these women necessarily must be competing with each other. And you get excited with that previous scene of them connecting and not blaming each other and finding solace in each other. And then Margaret walks back in and you're just like, well, that's out the window. Like, really trusted Shakespeare to be able to have this comparison between the women coming together as the men are falling apart, and then Margaret comes back in, and then this weird scene between the Queen and Richard happens. Because you think to yourselves, these are going to be the moments like the Duchess and the Queen have just fallen so far, and Margaret will be able to understand that and pity them, and that's precisely not what happens. Like, she just tears into these women while still somehow recognizing, like, it's all the men's doing. This entire conversation is about the men in their families, yet somehow we have to hate on each other as women who are connected to these men, without, again, like, recognizing how unwilling that connection actually is. Like, the Duchess of York did not have any control whatsoever in what child was born to her. And the play really does seem to be playing up this, like, nature aspect rather than the nurture, because all the women sort of assume that Richard came out of the womb as, like, they call him just a dog, like a beast, an animal. So they really do seem to be playing up on this idea that the nature he has today was the nature he had at birth. Not any of their actions, not anything about nurture. It's purely how, like, his nature was what he had from the very beginning. So, like, the Duchess of York, if that's true, if it's purely nature, the Duchess of York had no control of this because she just didn't get to pick what kid she has. And we need to recognize at this point in time, nobody has control really over who they marry. Female-wise, for the most part, unless you're already, like, in a serious position of power with some, like, really understanding male, like, family members, or some also equally powerful female family members. But even then, it's still sort of, it's not like I have free reign to pick who I fall in love with. It's I doing what I'm told to do. So, like, none of these women are at fault for any of the actions. Margaret even states this. Margaret's going through all of the deaths, all of the torment she's faced, and she's constantly naming other men as the people who did this. And she even recognizes that with the suffering of the other women. Richard, of course, is the major name coming up repeatedly as the person who killed people. But, like, Margaret says directly to the Duchess, like, your Clarence is dead, who killed my Edward. And I'm just like, this would be the time you'd hope for some understanding, right? Where everyone has suffered, and that's bad, right? And you don't need to force each other to suffer more. But Margaret is precisely like that other side of things. You can either choose not to harm other people because you have been harmed, or you can choose to harm other people because you have been harmed. So Margaret actually becomes a lot more like Richard. Richard came into this play with this concept that I will be the villain. Nobody treats me right, so I will be the villain. And that's what we're actually seeing then echoed in Margaret coming in. She's also the one, like, one of the people that's lasted the longest. She is sort of one of these survivors, just like Richard is. She's fought tooth and nail in her own ways of doing it. Richard by being this very charismatic figure. Margaret by being sort of this off-putting, prophetic character of this nature. And they've both gotten to this point through the suffering of others. And they're willing to just keep going. Like, neither of them can take anything back at this point in time. They just need to keep going. And Richard might have less of a claim that he suffered. Margaret obviously has like a very strong claim of all these dead people in her family that she's suffered. But like, you've got these two surprising characters that are suddenly paired up precisely because Margaret cannot forgive and meet these two women who are at their lowest at this moment head on. And she precisely becomes sort of this figure then that the Queen seems to reach for, to be this prophetic, cursing widow of a woman who survived this entire time and takes nothing back. She actually asks Margaret, like, teach me how to curse. And Margaret says your experiences will do that to you. But that's again that question of how do you respond to the worst of circumstances, right? Do you become a force for good, or do you become another destructive force? And the Queen definitely seems to be moving towards that other destructive force, because she wants to be able to learn how to curse properly. Curse like Margaret curses. Which is then very interesting with this follow-up conversation with Richard, because you think she wants to curse properly precisely to curse Richard. Like, he is the enemy at this moment. But that choice to be a destructive force is shown in this conversation with Richard how badly that can actually get twisted. And it does depend on how you want to view this set of scenes, because that fifth scene is really important for the outcome of this conversation, depending on how you view it. Because the question is Margaret lying to Richard to agree with him to buy time, and thus those letters that the Earl of Derby mentioned sending to Richmond saying Elizabeth will marry him are written after this conversation? Or have those letters been written prior to this point, and then this conversation happens, and again a split, and the Queen is just buying time for Richard to come in, for Richmond to come in, or is she actually agreeing with Richard's plan here? And that's precisely the moment that we really need to pick on, though it's hard to tell. Like, Shakespeare actually leaves it very undecided, very ambiguous about whether or not the Queen has decided to side with Richard or with Richmond and his enemies. Because that's going to be that choice between being a destructive force and being a force for good. Because a force for good at this point in time, by recognition, is likely, like, in a really bad position, and is likely going to result in one's death. If you're trying to do the right thing, like, to Richard's face, then you're going to run into problems. And we start seeing this with Richard's anger at his own messengers and how badly he's lashing out. The fact that he's taking children hostages, right? So the Duchess actually removes herself. She decides, like, I am done. I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to get involved in this. I curse you and I wash my hands of you, and she leaves. The Queen stays. So if we want to play off the later scene where the letters were written after this conversation, then the Queen is actively making the choice, in all likelihood, to sacrifice herself so that her daughter is not wrapped up in Richard. And she kind of speaks about this in really weird ways, because she says that she'll claim the daughter was a bastard, she'll, like, ruin her beauty, she'll make her daughters nuns, things like that. She does seem to be fighting for her surviving children. But there's this weird turn when the better chance of Elizabeth's survival with Richard seems to be her marriage to Richard, and the Queen seems to turn towards this possibility. And can you be a force for good? Can you take down a villain like this if your child is at risk? The Earl of Derby seems to make reference that in at least some way you certainly can try and subvert the enemy. And this is a sacrifice you're going to have to make, no matter how heartbreaking it actually is. But this conversation could go the other way with the Queen. It could be that she is actively choosing to become more like Margaret and more like Richard, and if she's going to survive and just be this destructive force, then she'll do it. And she'll do it fully. Because some productions of this play have a very chaste kiss at the end where, like, the Queen doesn't enjoy it, but others actually have, like, very passionate kisses in this moment, which gives you a sense that the Queen has fully sort of developed into a Margaret figure, where she's chosen, because she's suffered so much, to just make others suffer. And what's deeply uncomfortable about that, then, is the outcome seems to be the same. If she chooses to make other people suffer, then precisely the people who will suffer in this moment, if she does side with Richard, are her remaining children. But if she chooses to be a force for good, there is a risk of having to sacrifice those children anyways. So do we actually have a choice here if the outcome is precisely the same? And what choice is being made is, like, deeply uncomfortable and fully depends, like, on your view of the Queen throughout the play, whether or not she would make a choice here. Because Richard honestly thinks that he's won this woman over, and he finds it, like, rather disgusting. Like, she leaves and he makes a comment about how changeable women are. And, like, it's meant to be this uncomfortable feeling that women will do anything to survive. Because we've had Margaret, who's been this survivor, who just has no friends, curses everybody, doesn't care if you're suffering, she'll just dig her nails in anyway. And the Queen seems to be following that. And Margaret's similarity then to Richard makes you, like, really uncomfortable, because they up that. Because he talks about changeable women in regards to the Queen, and then we precisely have this conversation with two of his servants after this point, where he is so mixed up in his own head, he becomes that changeable character himself. Because he's got the two of them, and he's trying to give them separate orders, but he doesn't complete what he's saying, he keeps bouncing between the two, and then gets angry when the one hasn't left, and he's like, you told me where to go, you didn't tell me what to tell them. And so he says, okay, this is what you need to do. That guy leaves, and the other servant goes, what do you want me to do while I'm over here? And he's like, well, why would you go there? You literally just told me to go there. And Richard says, I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind. So, Shakespeare has not just left the Queen ambiguous here, he's precisely then paired this possible changeability up with Richard again. So these two women, and arguably also the Duchess, because she plays this strange, uncomfortable conversation between, listen, I'll be patient, I'll speak kindly, I wish you had never been born, type conversation. So we've got a changeability there that Richard is quite possibly inherited from his mother. So we've suddenly got these three surviving women who no longer find solstice in each other, and quite possibly only find solstice in the destruction of everybody else around them. And Richard is like them. Or they're like Richard. Because we have from the very beginning said Richard is the bad guy. He himself has told us this. So you want to hope that everybody else is good. But that previous scene even allows us again to see the goodness of these women coming together, and that's just completely undercut here. Everybody that might have had a chance to actually honestly be good, we killed much earlier in the play. Like Clarence, we killed off. The two young princes, we killed off. And we killed off. And from there, we just have these surviving characters that are just so wrecked and ruined by this entire thing that we can't say any of them are like outright the good guys. We might be cheering for Richard to be defeated, but that's precisely the problem with wars. Those innocent people who have been affected can't be unaffected by this. The Queen might have been a fantastic person prior to this point, but she's gone through so much that's going to affect her so deeply that after this point, can you really blame her if she is like Margaret? Just so many people have died, her brothers have died, her husband's died, her sons have died. Can you blame her? Well, that means you have to offer forgiveness to Margaret as well. She's suffered through this as well. And in doing that, you have to try and see if you can allow for some forgiveness for Richard. Maybe he did truly suffer that pushed him to this point. And that's the issue. All of these people are deeply flawed human beings who have just lived in a world that has been constant warfare. We are precisely in the middle, and actually surprisingly towards the end of the War of the Roses. This has been going on for generations. They don't know anything else but this destructive aspect, with the tiniest hope that maybe they could be the last ones. But to be the last ones means that you need to destroy your enemies. And that's a really uncomfortable feeling here, right? We want to see Richard destroyed. But how much of this... It's a cycle of violence that's just continuing. And the question becomes, when does one side stop and forgive their enemies in order to stop this bloodshed? Because Margaret obviously has not made that choice. She has been stuck in this cycle of violence, and she is fully willing to continue it to watch her enemies suffer. And it's the question of whether or not the Queen isn't going in that direction, or even if she has a choice. Because this cycle, unfortunately, is not going to stop. The War of the Roses might come to an end, but the fact that we can find related messages, even for today, in Richard III, tells me that we have never fully stopped this cycle. Violence creates violence. Death creates death. Does the Queen have a choice here? Is Margaret affecting her that badly? And what actually happens when the women step off the stage entirely? The very last act is purely a male-centered act. What does that mean for the women who have suffered so much? Why are they not here when everything is supposed to end? Maybe that speaks for itself. I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.